All right, welcome to your guide to the first exam of the year. This is our economic unit exam, and what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the sources together. And while we take a look at the sources, I'm going to talk about the type of questions you can anticipate. Here's the source that we've seen in one of the previous lessons, as they all will be included in the lessons. So when you look at this source, some of the questions I could ask you is, supporters of the cartoonist from source 1 would respond to the cartoonist from 2. So we have two cartoons, both about unionization of labor. One that looks at individualism, one that's looking at collectivism, and I want you to be able to see how they would respond to each other. This is a skill similar to an A1 skill, isn't it? How would the two sources respond to each other? So supporters of this cartoonist would respond to the supporters of this cartoonist perspective by doing what? And how would you review for this question? Review the terms individualism and collectivism and maybe unions. Another question that you're going to see connected to source 2 is which of the following individuals would agree with this message? So we're going to ask you to take the central message of the cartoon and say, who's going to support this? Would it be a Keynesian economist? Would it be a democratic socialist? Would it be a free market enthusiast? So we're going to get you to take different groups along the economic spectrum and now apply it to an ideological perspective. Also key to this will be to understand the economic parties in Canada. What do the NDP think? What do the Liberals think? What do the Conservatives think? So we have a couple of questions at the beginning of the test that look at individualism and collectivism, look at unionization, but also have you compare and contrast two messages and then apply a message to a perspective. Those are some skills associated with some content outcomes. So now we have questions 3 and 4. And with regards to questions 3 and 4, we have this source number 3, which is a quick quote. I love how short it is, from Henry George about a rising tide doesn't raise all boats. Now, I want you to understand the evolution of liberalism here. Liberalism is an ideology by definition is evolving from classic through the progressive era into modern liberalism, and then we have a reaction to that with the neoclassic liberalism. I want you to be able to pinpoint. It says 1879, so that's a hint there, right? Pinpoint. What is Henry George referring to? Is what time period might this be? And then take that and connect it to another example. His claim is also illustrated when something else happens. So now that we understand how it happens in 1879, can we come up with a parallel example? Is this similar to Hoover's claim about poverty being a local concern? Is this similar to Reagan saying that the benefits will trickle down? Supply side economics. Is this similar in theory to Adam Smith and his invisible hand? Or is this showing the irrational and speculative nature of the 2008 financial meltdown? So not only is it important to understand the context of it historically, but we want you to be able to create a parallel. Understanding the forces behind this quote, and I want you to say, these are the same forces behind this other scenario. Then we often ask you questions about solutions. There's a problem in this source, then which of the following solutions would a neoclassical liberal like? So if that's a problem, what would a neoclassical liberal say? And, again, go back to your vocabulary. Words like progressive taxation could be on the exam here. And yeah, we'll see how you do with that one. Then moving on, we have questions 5 to 8, and we have source 4 about before the crash. So one of the main case studies that we have is the Great Depression. So we're definitely going to have some sources that hold you responsible to that time period. And we're going to use terms like modern economic liberalism. In a modern liberal economy like Canada, the roles credited to Henry Ford here. Who does those roles? So Henry Ford is a industrial paternalist. He's providing welfare capitalism. But who does that today in a modern liberal economy? That will be your question. In this source, there's going to be some reading comprehension questions. So a reading comprehension question is when we take a phrase from the source and then get you to respond to it. So, for example, when it says Henry Ford made a groundbreaking change, right? I could use that term groundbreaking change and say, in the world of 2021, what has been another groundbreaking change to modern economics? That's not going to be on the test, but that's just an example of pulling a phrase from a quote and then having you do something with that phrase. All right. We also have a quote number 5, that looks at the Hoover years. And within quote number 5, we're going to get you to talk about basically reading through it and finding a main concern. Main concern of the Hoover government should have been. So this is a reading comprehension question where you read through the source, and as you're reading through it, you look for a main concern. But the test has 4 main concerns on it, right? So then those are like themes that you read through it and say, is there evidence that this is the answer over this? So that's a way to look at it. It's kind of a matching thing. So you might need to skim through it 4 times and say how many sentences go with this main concern as opposed to this other one. Taking a step back to source 4 for a second. Sorry about that. But there will be some connections in source 4 to the alphabet agencies, the SEC that I've talked about, the Security Exchange Commission, and the textbook also talks about the Better Business Bureau, the BBB. And 2 other acts that I want to make sure that you understand will be on the test, at least mentioned, are the Glass-Steagall Act and the Dodd-Frank Act. The Glass-Steagall Act and the Dodd-Frank Act, along with the SEC and BBB, will all be listed to say that the delusional optimism talked about within the source, right here, the delusional optimism, how are they going to address it? Which of those acts will address the delusional optimism connected to buying on the margin? So I just thought I'd take a wee little step back to look at that. With the Hoover quote again, quote 5, we're going to get you to say, now that you've read it and you understand the main concern here, in the Canadian context, similar concerns led to what? So this is where we need you to know about Bennett and Bennett's response to the Great Depression. Connected to that might be things like the On to Ottawa Trek, the Regina riots, and to what extent within Canada, Bennett introduced his own New Deal. Another type of question that we can ask for a source like this is, what would be a good headline? This is another one of those holistic questions, reading comp really by nature. It says, you've read through the source, you understand, what it's about. If you're going to summarize what it's about into one sentence, one headline, which of these 4 would it be? Another reading comprehension kind of thing. We could also have a source like the Hoover years quote here and say, based upon what you've read here, how would a Marxist respond? How would a capitalist respond? How would a mixed economist respond? So another way for us to hold you responsible is to try to see if you can see an ideological perspective's response to this kind of source. And that's source 5. Source 6 is also about the New Deal. So again, chapter 4, chapter 6, Great Depression, a big part of this test. Connected to chapter 6 will be, again, taking language from the source and connecting it to economic practices. So we'll take a phrase from the source that will be quoted in the question, and we want you to link it to either austerity or progressive taxation or fiscal responsibility or stimulus spending. So if you built your glossary of key terms, then you'll understand what those terms are. And then on the test, you'll need to take a quote that we're giving you from the passage and say, is this an example of austerity? Is this an example of stimulus spending? Is it fiscal responsibility or progressive taxation? Next up, we're going to say the writer of source 6 critically indicates that as a consequence of government policy, something happens. So we want you to read through this and say that, oh, okay, at the end of reading this, what has been the consequence? As a consequence of what they're talking about, what change has been created? How would supporters of liberalism respond to this is another question. Next up, we have a return to the right and the next source. A response to the claim that the post-war era was a golden age. How would collectivists, communists, capitalists, and individualists respond to that claim? That the post-World War II or World War I era was a golden age, in this case World War II. How would a collectivist respond? How would a communist respond? So to get these questions right, you would have to understand, what are the core values of a collectivist, a communist, a capitalist, an individualist, and how might they respond to a claim that America is a golden age based upon the description of America provided here. Once again, in context, it's going to use a phrase, and we're going to get you to pull out a phrase. And we're going to get you to connect it to some of your cast of characters. So yes, you're going to need to know Milton Friedman tomorrow, and Frederick Hayek, and Ayn Rand, but also Noam Chomsky has come up as a socialist. And you should review what Chomsky values in terms of economic socialism. As long as you know that about Chomsky, I guess you know enough. Still the same source. Lots of questions on this source. Again, we're going to get you to take a quote and see if you can see what it's inferring a reference to. So this is an A1 skill as well. Take a quote from a source and say, when they say this, we can infer that they're relating it to that. So that's a reading comprehension question. And we'll have some combining questions. Combining elements from this source and another source, what conclusion can we make about the Great Depression? You'll have some cartoon analysis to do. You might have to look at the details within the cartoon and come up with a conclusion. So when you look at the details, you can always zoom in tomorrow because you're going to get a digital copy. Zooming in, you can read the letters. Okay, chicken in every pot, rugged individualism, car in every garage, prosperity around the corner, commission form of government, FDR's got all that stuff in the garbage can, and Herbert Hoover is walking away. So you can always zoom in on the test to see the fine details. We might ask you to continue an ideological perspective being presented. So here's a perspective, and then we'll say to continue the perspective as shown, what? What about the labels? What's the significance of the labels? Here's a look at FDR requesting more power to deal with the Great Depression, and he's looking at the executive branch of government. That's who he is, and he's taking more power away from Congress. So we want you to connect that to your cast of characters, to people like Hobbes and Carlyle and Mill and Montesquieu, and see if you know who talked about the idea of separation of power. And again, there'll be sources about relationships. A relationship that exists between two columns is, how does this connect to that? Are they is there some challenges? Is there some policies? Would the voices agree with each other? Would they be unhappy with each other? That sort of stuff. And how would a collectivist respond to it? How would an individualist respond to it? How would Smith respond to it? How would Marx respond to what's being said here? Is a classic way to phrase a question. Looking further, we have, the government at the time of this cartoon. What kind of economic policy are they implementing based upon the details here? Is it Are they going with central plan, supply side, mix, Keynesian economics? So you should be able to look at the details within the cartoon and figure out what kind of economic system it is. And then we have some quotes connected to the '08 financial meltdown, and you should be able to connect these two things together to see a common story. And then the test ends. Yeah, it's that quick. There's only 32 questions. It ends with a chart of nations, and we should see some changes, right? So these are nations from hypothetical nations 2010, right before an election, hypothetical nations 2015, right before their next election. So what we're trying to see is the change in unemployment percentages, the change in corporate tax rates, the change in inflation, the change in percentage of people living below poverty, right? The change in all of these. And as we look at that, we can look for things like, from the perspective of a neoconservative or a neoliberal, which nation implemented the most appropriate change? Or who effectively implemented a fiscal policy to ease the suffering of citizens? Or a business owner, right? A capitalist would be most concerned with new policies in which country? Or which country maintained laissez-faire capitalism? So we're going to get you to look at those data and say, yeah, you know what? This is capitalist in both. Or this one was capitalist and now it's not. That business owner is not going to like this. Or this one had suffering and now they have fiscal policy to deal with that suffering. So the test ends with questions 29 to 32, and they're all going to be related on this data, and you need to be able to see some trends and base some conclusions on those trends. Based on the trends, what kind of economic system is being implemented? And that, my friends, is it. It's a test of 32 questions, where in the past some students have gotten either close to or right there at that 32 out of 32 mark. So review, ask me questions during our 2 o'clock hangout if you need to, and I'm sure you'll do well.